Connected Things conference is normally a springtime, March timeframe at the MIT Media Lab. With coronavirus, obviously, we are looking at different ways to present our material. This year, we're planning on something probably in a virtual way in the springtime frame, and kind of watch this space to stay tuned on dates and times. But we're going to explore themes this year around all connected things: 5G, IoT, AI, private networks, transient and permanent devices. Our keynotes are all coming together. Our point and counterpoint and other panels are coming together. So watch this space. I'm very excited today. We have a very interesting guest whose work I've been actually looking at. That's some work is available and searchable and incorporated into other reports. I've got the CEO of IoT Analytics, and he's joining us from a lovely town in Germany, as you can see over his left shoulder as the sun goes down or gets ready to go down there. But why don't you introduce yourself and let's talk a little bit about IoT Analytics.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. No sun here, unfortunately, but we haven't had that for a while. Deep winter. Yeah, my name is Knud. As you rightly said, I run a company called IoT Analytics, and we are a market research company focused on everything that is IoT. I am based in Hamburg here in Germany. I founded the company in 2014. Maybe a little bit about myself. I'm an industrial engineer by background. So, I like to think of myself as a very analytical guy. I like to go very deep. And I think that's led me to founding IoT Analytics 6 years ago, because I was from my engineering background. I did a few years in consulting, and I was consulting some of the industrial companies here in Germany. And I saw this opportunity of the really connected world, how this was starting to make an impact and open up. And I wanted to explore it further and further than just a couple of consulting projects. And that's actually why I founded the company at that time, because I felt, hey, there's a huge opportunity. And I personally have quite an interest to go deep and understand what's going on. And I think the company in that sense kind of represents a little bit what my passions are, which is not to stay superficial, but to really explore stuff.
Well, that's the nice thing. When you start a company, you get to do what you want because it's yours. So that's great. Yeah. And we talked about this previously. You come from a different perspective. A lot of the market research firms and analysts that I speak with come from a telco perspective. And I think it's interesting. We've had a previous a podcast or a session with our mutual friend Matt Hatton from Transforma, and he comes from a telco standpoint. What do you feel the advantages from your standpoint to being more from the industrial engineering side of things?
Yeah, I think there's actually probably even another aspect to it, which is I've never been trained as in research. Like, my background was, I did last 5 years for this, I was doing consulting, strategy consulting. And so I had a different, I would say, an adjacent area. We were procuring all these research reports, and I saw it from that point of view. And when I entered into the research field, I had no clue about analyst briefings and the kind of things that, the kind of processes there are in this area. So I think that's one difference. The other one, I think you rightly pointed out, I think in the telco space, for some reason, there's a lot of analysts that come from the telco space, cater to the telco space, and in some instances have kind of moved into other areas or expanded into other areas. I think when I look at IoT, there are at least 3 big buckets, I would like to call it. So there is the whole talk about the consumer IoT, obviously. So anything from your Apple Watch to your Bluetooth speakers to your Echo, whatever, like these things would be considered consumer IoT devices. And I think there's a whole industry around the consumer and research in the consumer space. And then there is the second one is the telco space, which is anything around cellular connectivity, connecting things remotely. And then the third one, and that's probably the one that I'm closest to, is the whole manufacturing industrial point of view, which looks at, among other things, where all these other points, you have touch points to these other areas, but really looks at how you connect a factory, how you connect industrial assets out in the field. And a lot of this telco actually doesn't play that big of a role. So there's quite a contrast. We as a company try to cater to all of these, but I would say manufacturing probably is one of the strong areas of what what we cater to.
I think it makes sense. I think from the factory standpoint, I've participated in enough briefings with vendors like SAP and others. A couple years ago, I was in Germany at one of the SAP events and met factory, managers, people that, build compressors and, the typical Industry 4.0 folks. And, a lot of them talk about how, within the four walls of a factory, everything's connected in a certain way. If they're connected at all, they might just be siloed inside a particular machine's domain, if you will. So how do you see these things fleshing out? Because the telcos, their thesis is 5G is everywhere, or it's becoming available globally, and that gives you more flexibility in the manufacturing realm. What's your point of view on that?
I think there are a lot of different developments. 5G is just one of them. If you think of 5G, I think that there's a lot of marketing push behind 5G, a lot of money being put into 5G, and for a lot of good reasons as well. I think 5G is a technology that clearly advances the 4G standard in terms of bandwidth, in terms of latency, and in terms of a few other features which are really new, including like slicing the network and so on. So
that's right.
There's some really, really cool stuff there. How important is 5G for the world, really? We're seeing already that it's very important for the consumer. A lot of people are adopting it, and it's from an IoT point of view, there are 5G. I'm a little bit skeptical as to how quickly and how pervasive 5G is going to be used, and I have many reasons for that. The first thing is some of the 4G implementations are going to be moved over to 5G. It makes sense. There's various reasons. The car industry is one of those industries that are just quite naturally starting to produce cars that have 5G connectivity in it. And even if they don't know all the use cases yet, they're just doing it because that's exactly how they did it in 4G, where they started building it and then they realized, hey, there's quite a few use cases and it made sense. So there is stuff happening. There's other use cases like video surveillance. Whenever you don't really have a cable connection ready, streaming video is obviously a lot of bandwidth, and smaller use cases that are related to that. That could be your TV camera that streams right into the studio, not having to go through one of these trucks that's standing outside the stadium or whatever. Like there's a lot of very interesting use cases. When it comes to the factory and the industry, there are a lot of things going on right now where companies are especially trialing private 5G, where they have their own network, building up the car companies here in Germany, but also in the US, to my knowledge, are all trialing some kind of private 5G right now, where they either connect their cars they've produced to know where it is, what's happening, some of the goods, some of the indoor tracking. There's a couple of use cases they're trying out. And I think this is good. It clearly competes with something like Wi-Fi 6, which is the new Wi-Fi standard. Some people argue Wi-Fi much cheaper because you already have Wi-Fi. It competes with some other connectivity technologies as well. And some people are laying out this vision of this completely 5G connected factory, no more cables needed. Everything powered through electricity from the floor. So I think this is a really nice vision. But if you practically think about, is this going to happen? No, it's not going to happen in the next 10 years. Maybe for some very specific parts or some demonstration factories. I think there are a couple of reasons to believe that this is not happening. For example, the Well, first of all, the latency in 5G is great, but it's never as good as a cable. Like for a lot of real-time critical mass manufacturing, and I've talked to a bunch of people who've said like, yeah, it's nice, but I mean, it says 1 millisecond in theory, but this is just in theory. If you really think about, there's got to be a back and forth, and you got to put a little bit of buffer in, and then you're really talking 10 milliseconds. And a lot of manufacturing processes can't actually work on a 10 milliseconds. That's too slow for them. So with that in mind, it's not suited to everything. And then manufacturing, as you know, is like it's an industry that's slow. It's an industry that doesn't want to adapt. It's like you have a running factory, you don't change it. So we're talking about some new greenfield or some add-ons to existing factories, or some processes that are not as time critical. So, for example, I'm sitting in a building here right now, and there's some digital things where the blinds adjust to the sunlight and whatever. If this needed something like 5G, that could work. But I'm somewhat skeptical
but that's not a critical application. Adjusting the keeping the sun out of your eyes is nice, but no big deal. I mean, the energy
maybe not a good example for 5G, but what I'm trying to say is, if I talk to the manufacturing folks, 5G is not on top of their mind.
So it's interesting because you contrast that with, in the EU, we're reading all the private 5G licenses, especially Germany, that are being issued for, all the German manufacturers, Volkswagen famously, Siemens famously have been looking at creating that. So those are kind of standalone private 5G deployments or POCs, whatever you want to call it. And then you have folks like Vodafone talking about a hybrid, 5G. And again, I know you're not on the telco side, but you have this notion of it's private within the realm of the industrial campus, the grounds of the factory. But then if an asset moves off campus, it then goes onto the public network. So what are you actually seeing? Again, it's getting a lot of notice and write-ups and all of the trade publications and all the conferences are talking about this. On the ground, not so much.
It is happening. People are trialing it, and there's a bunch of trials out there. It's just that the results and the importance of these results for the business operations, it's not super critical to them right now. There are alternatives, and it's expensive. I mean, here in Germany, I think there was some good foresight that a part of the spectrum was reserved just for this private 5G, because this could become quite important for specific parts. But I'm just cautioning the world doesn't dramatically shift with this. There are some incremental changes. You are using it for some positioning, localization, and in some cases, non-time critical automation tasks. And maybe in 20 years, this conversation is different. I mean, we're starting something, but I'm just cautioning that this where people think in 2025 the world is different. Disruption does happen quickly, but in these parts, manufacturing it takes longer than some people think.
Well, don't you also have the people issue? Training people to do things differently. They've learned certain things in school. They know how to operate. And I think we'll talk also about PLCs and things like that from your other report that I read through. People are trained in a certain thing and follow their career through, based on their backgrounds and on their training.
Yeah, that's very true. And I think that's one of the things that comes out again and again when we do surveys with companies, especially manufacturers, but also in other areas, that, hey, let's stop talking about technology. Let's start talking about the stuff that makes technology work. And it is not technology that makes technology work. So when we ask people, what are the key success factors to making things like 5G, but also other technologies work? The answer, we had a survey last year, what makes Industry 4.0 technologies work? 1 out of 10 of the top responses were technology related. The other 9 were people oriented, business case oriented. So and people oriented answers are the number one thing. So the number one thing is training your people and getting the skills on board. That's the number one success factor when you ask CIOs and other people, engineers, what is making this successful. And that's what people oftentimes don't put enough effort into, don't prioritize early enough, and that goes into hiring the right people, training the right people, retaining the right people, and it's difficult, like you say. And if you then go to specific, I mean, cloud is a huge area right now. Everybody is somehow moving to cloud, but a lot of the IT folks in some of these, let's call them rusty organizations, they don't have the people who understand containerization, some of these newer development environments, and it's difficult for them to get these skills and to get this moving.
So that's where you start seeing the vendor community move to help folks in that area. You know, to provide those services. You focus on building your widget, your part, your compressor, whatever it is, and we'll help you move into the cloud and, you know, move into virtualization. That's kind of the vendor theme or the vendor story, which, you know, comes at a cost. But the theory is that that's offset by improvements in efficiency and yield and profitability and things of that nature. You know, this is your old consulting hat, you know, before being an analyst. Yeah. Do you see that as a message that takes hold with enterprise CIOs?
Not fully, because you don't want to be dependent on a couple of vendors or one vendor. This vendor lock-in is a real concern, and while they may be able to help you quite a bit, you become completely dependent on what they develop. You lose control. You don't like. Some of this stuff is core to these companies. If you are a pump manufacturer or whatever, and now you're offering digital services on top of that, this becomes a differentiator for you and of your offering. You don't want to have that with a vendor who may switch something, who you're dependent on, who may make this super expensive in the future. You just really don't know. And you want to be able to innovate on that yourself. I hear that very often, and that's, while it's true that it's good that the vendor community is helping out, every company is trying to decide to what degree they are able to control some of this, either by having in-house people. Another option is to work with startups who are a lot more flexible. And I think one of the winning models that I've seen is where companies invest in those startups that they work with, where it's a real close business tie. It doesn't work all the time because you have, at some point, all the startups have been taken and all the good ones, let's say. But I've seen this a few times happening, for example, here in Germany in the machinery industry, which is quite big here, where a couple of these bigger machinery companies have invested strategically in some of those startups that then help them build up some of these capabilities.
I think it makes a lot of sense. You know, but and again, I'm trying to transition a little bit to the soft PLC report. But you know, before that, you know, along the way there's a lot of motion again around this notion of a digital twin. I know a few years ago that was very popular, and then it looks like it kind of, the interest sort of dipped, and now I'm seeing digital twin come back. And I'm wondering if you could, first of all, compare and contrast soft PLC with digital twin, and then we'll get into the soft PLC stuff. Okay.
So digital twin to me is a buzzword. It is. I mean, we're talking a lot of buzzwords, and one of my job is to make sense of these buzzwords. We've had a study at the beginning of last year where we looked at what exactly is a digital twin, and we actually found out that from our research point of view, there's 250 definitions of a digital twin depending on what you make it. So digital twin can be, you know, some people refer to a PDF document that's uploaded somewhere online as a digital twin. That's a digital twin of the machine. Other people are saying, wait, no, digital twin, you mean the 3D model of that we've drawn here. And then another one says, no, it's not about the 3D model. It's about the ability to see whatever the machine or whatever you have is currently doing in a virtual model in terms of the process parameters, not necessarily the visualization. So again, there's 100 of different ways of what a digital twin is. I agree with you.
It's a Rorschach test, in other words, where they show you an ink blot and it's a rabbit. No, it's my mother, or
I mean, it's a pretty good term that describes a lot of things. But the problem is that I've seen this a few times now, that people talk about digital twin and they mean something completely different. Which, by the way, has also happened with the buzzword IoT, where you had somebody saying IoT and meaning something else and somebody else.
That last one, as you may know, is my favorite topic. Is I always say that I don't want my things on the internet, and obviously we talked about this before. The term IoT emerged from the MIT Media Lab, coined by a guy named Kevin Ashton, very quickly just throwing the word internet on his PowerPoint deck as he tells the story, just to put some sexiness and pizzazz, because in 1999 the word internet was a very cool term, and then it's evolved into people thinking it's everything on the internet. And to me, it's you put a sensor on a thing connected to the network, but it's not necessarily visible on the internet. If you have things, if you have industrial things on the internet, you've got big problems.
Exactly, which is why some people ask me, well, there are these search engines out there that can search all these IoT devices. Have you seen it? Are you not using it? I'm like, no, I'm not really using it, because most of these devices, I mean, I think our forecast is about 12 billion IoT devices at this point.
Right.
The majority of them are not visible, and they shouldn't be, like you said. So back to the original question of digital twin. And so what I wanted to say is, yes, I see that this term is, when you said it was dipping, it's coming up again. We actually have an analysis that we are publishing in the next 3 or 4 weeks. We've started to do this every quarter now, where we do a big analysis of the earnings calls of Wall Street firms and other companies, and we look for specific keywords. And one thing we actually found in our latest analysis, that the term digital twin in Q4 2020 was starting to trend very much in these calls, which is a pretty good indication that companies are at least investing in it from a vendor point of view. They don't all have to be end users, but from a vendor community point of view. So yes, the term is hot, but it means a lot of things. I find it very hard to contrast that into what you were referring to, the soft PLC, which is it's a very niche topic right now, even for us within IoT. Do you want me to talk a little bit about that?
I want to go into that, and also the report, obviously, that we talked about in our kind of preparatory call a week or two ago, and your talk around the Clayton Christensen book. So I thought it was a super interesting thing. It kind of moved you from the realm of just kind of reporting this many widgets from this vendor have been sold in Q4 into sort of almost a more business philosophical realm. So I'm going to give you sort of a wide berth here to kind of go through your thesis.
I'm happy you say that, because I think you can produce data points, you can make sense of the data points and produce information, or you can go one step further and produce insights and from connect the different pieces of information and actually come up with an insight, and perhaps even into recommendations for companies. And I always like to look a little bit further than just the individual data points. And so when we had a discussion in the team on the manufacturing side of things into what we are seeing, even though this is a very niche topic, it is one that we felt, wow, this is one that can be really big, which is really changing the world, and it's not being talked about a lot. And when we then looked into how we can show to people what's happening there, we realized that the Innovators Dilemma, which some people may be familiar with, is quite a good concept to apply here. So for those who are not familiar with the Innovators Dilemma, it's a book by Clayton Christensen, best-selling book, which I think is a must-read for anyone interested in innovation, which kind of describes why actually do big companies fail, and why do some startups become big companies? How is that possible with all the big money and all the innovation R&D departments? And so the one of the famous examples is Kodak, that controlled the market for photographs, for cameras. And then even invented the digital camera and then got disrupted by it at the end and went bankrupt. And we felt that this topic of PLC virtualization could actually be applied to the innovator, or the innovator's dilemma could be applied to this topic. And so what's happening here is factories, machines, buildings, everything that we know is currently run by automation hardware known as PLC, in many instances known as PLCs, programmable logical controller, PLC.
Right.
And so typically these are boxes that, not too big, often some enhancements that pretty much have a hardwired logic in it that can do very quick decision making, and your whole factory floor is essentially steered through this. This is the brain.
Right.
And the big companies are Siemens, Rockwell Automation, ABB. You've heard of those companies, and they make a good chunk of their money in these areas. But the softwareization is not stopping there. It is moving into that space. And so what we're starting to see is that there is some generalized hardware, industrial grade PCs, for example, that can run software that can do essentially the same thing or even a better thing than these hardwired, quite robust, but also fairly inflexible pieces of hardware you have right now at a portion of the cost. And so Christensen said, and this is what happened in Kodak, that at the beginning, these digital cameras were inferior. They were not as good. The pictures were not as good, and nobody in the industry probably felt this was much of a threat. And you see this right now with this. Yes, the first industrial PCs running some software, but at the end of the day, at least in the previous years, you couldn't do as much. It wasn't seen as secure, and adoption was rather low. But as we go on, it seems that the hardware, the edge computers, if you want, are becoming more powerful. The software that runs on them is becoming more established and can do a lot of things. I mean, you then have a developer community on the software that all of a sudden can easily, program an app on this. Something that if you have a very, very rigid piece of hardware, you can't do anything with. You can't even do a firmware update in some instances. And this is the new normal, and this is what's happening. And so it feels like these PLCs could get disrupted with these soft PLCs. And it brings one more point. It brings up an interesting question of will those who lead the market today, will they be tomorrow's leaders? So meaning, will they pick up this innovation or not? And there is some reason to believe that the Siemenses and Rockwell Automations of the world will actually pick this up and become champions of this, but it's not very clear.
So I think your own report quoted, I think, roughly $200 million worth of soft PLCs by the end of last year, going to 450 million in the next 4 years. I hope I'm not misquoting you.
It's just the software. If you consider the hardware piece as well, because you got to compare the hardware today with the hardware that runs the new software. So it's true, but the market is in the billions already if you consider the hardware plus the software, which you would have to consider. Right. And if you then consider that we're talking about a portion of the price for the same capabilities,
right?
It is bigger, but the penetration at this point is single digits in terms of market penetration, growing.
But it's $500 million in market is not insignificant. That's a reasonable, if it's just the software only. Again, I'm just picking through various facts from your report. So
yeah, absolutely.
But it's it shows a trend too, in a trend of adoption. It's less about the number and it's more about the trend and the growth rate, I think.
Absolutely.
Now we talked about with respect to Kodak, just as a little aside. I'd worked on a project over at Polaroid, their arch nemesis, and we talked about one of the other contributing factors, in my view, was that Kodak and Polaroid were embroiled in a patent lawsuit for a long, long time. And ultimately, Kodak had to pay roughly $1 billion to Polaroid. And it was documented in a book that I enjoyed called A Triumph of Genius by a guy called Ron Fierstein. So I think they had, the non-understanding digital, plus they had the IP problem, and that was that didn't help. Writing $1 billion check back in that time period, that was real money back then.
Yeah.
From what I can tell. So I just kind of, back up a bit. So, it's interesting, we talked about, again, the role of a market researcher or market research firm. What are the challenges of doing what you do and what your team does? And how big is your team?
We are currently, depending always how you count, I'm going to say between 10 and 12 people.
Okay.
So we're not huge. We're a small boutique firm, but I mean, our vision is to become the holistic IoT research provider, which we are not today. We are doing portions of it. IoT is huge, and if you want to cater to the connected car vertical, to the smart buildings, and so on, you got to have quite a wide range of reports and topics that you cover. So in the next years, we already are catering to quite a few of these areas, but not to all of them. So so much about how big we are. Sorry, just your main question. I kind of slipped
just
on my.
Being the role of a market researcher and the challenges.
Yeah. No, I think the role is super interesting, especially because everything is so complex right now. So we are sitting, I consider myself sitting at the very left-hand side of the value chain for everything digital. People come to us and say, we are starting a project in smart city implementation and, building a new connected product.
Right.
And they come to us for research. And we try to give them insights that help them make good decisions. That's the main essence of what we do. And I think we measure ourselves by, do our clients trust our data and feel they can make good decisions on that? And that's the important thing of how we can. That's how we add value. I think there's a small other element to it. I think we always try to be. We can influence our clients in some cases, and I think it's important that we also highlight to them what are the important things. So for me, for example, right now, I am a firm believer that we got a problem with climate change and sustainability. And
yes,
as a research company, it's our obligation to show our clients, first of all, what the problem is, but then also, for example, how IoT technology can help. So we always, in some of our reports, we include IoT, we highlight projects that are sustainability related. We track things like global warming and show our clients how important that is. And I'm hoping that some of the execs get just another input that shows them, we need to care about this.
Look, I think it makes sense. I know of one very large Asian headquartered company where sustainability is sort of their mission statement or part of their mission statement. So it's a big deal. You see it. I mean, I won't get into any of the politics going on here in the States, but it's evident. It's not. I don't see it as a debatable point.
No, neither do I. I mean, I like to work with data. And I think there is at this point no more debate that it's happening, and also no more debate that it's man-made.
Right.
So those two factors, and I think 2020 was actually a really, really important year for sustainability. Believe it or not, I mean, COVID-19 and everything that happened. But when I look at what companies were talking about towards the end of 2019 and now at the end of 2020, I mean, we had companies like Microsoft in the meantime come out with a carbon negative by 2030, I believe, strategy. This carbon neutral has become, everybody needs to become the carbon neutral, and to be seen how much is talk and how much is going to be action. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of companies calculating some things left-hand side, right-hand side, and you ask yourself, did you really change much? But it has entered the very, very top and the strategies of companies. And I think it's not rare anymore to see that sustainability. I mean, we talked about Siemens earlier. I think they included towards the end of 2019 sustainability as one of their top 5 goals or something for the company. So this thing has accelerated quite a bit. I'm quite happy to see that we're looking for solutions right now.
So if I were to, one of my questions generally is predictions moving forward. I would say that's your prediction number one is globally more and more in the enterprise and industrial customer community and vendor community are taking sustainability quite a bit more seriously.
Yeah, I always find it really hard to predict because when I read predictions, they become so repeatable because you can't. So prediction for 21 versus prediction for 20, prediction 29. It's quite difficult to find 10 new topics every time. So then you read a lot of these predictions and they say, yeah, more AI, more IoT, and so on and so forth. So it is. I mean, we actually had a post out, I think, in 2019 where we predicted IoT and the environment to have more of be a bigger topic. And I would certainly say I see that trend continuing into the next years. I can talk about a few other trends, but I think it's not super surprising. I mean, migration to the cloud is happening on all levels, whether you're talking about HR systems, you're talking about ERP systems, you're talking about even some of the heavy manufacturing related. There's a lot of move to the cloud. And then people say, wait, what about the edge? I thought everything is moving to the edge. It's happening as well. Yeah, you're moving to the cloud and you're moving to the edge. And you're missing out a little bit in the middle, but an edge sometimes just means a more modern term for on-premise for some people. So yes, more edge, more cloud, more AI. Yes, there's more AI and everybody's investing. We get a lot of requests for, hey, can you help us understand what's the AI landscape? We actually had one of the things we recently talked about is this new term AIoT.
I saw yesterday AI. from Bosch made announcements.
Yeah, and Bosch. So we had it in our end of year review that this term has been picked up quite a bit in 2020 by different companies. And Bosch was just the latest example at CES where they used this. But we had, it actually comes from China. So other than the term IoT, which is, as you just described, was coined by Kevin Ashton in Boston. But AIoT, I believe, comes from Huawei or some of these other Chinese companies that have already worked with this term for a few years now. And now it's really swept into the rest of the world. I saw a bunch of US, Canadian companies use the term and European companies. So AIoT is one of those new buzzwords, which is, we're talking about.
Yeah, well, tying back to the theme of, my 2021 theme for the conference, it's inclusive of AI. I'm uncomfortable with anything that's, AI, when you push the two terms together, because I think taxonomy or terminology matters. And I think when you come up with, it's like you were saying with digital twin, it gets confusing, and it's already a confusing series of technical models and branding and terms that doesn't help anybody ultimately. But, so that would be artificial intelligence of things, I guess, would be the AIoT, or it's AI plus IoT equals AIoT. I don't know. We've got to go get some marketing people on it and come up with a better term.
Well, they've been saying that about IoT for a while, and it hasn't gone away because IoT is to a lot of people not what it, it's not a really perfect term. But
no, I agree.
Let's live with it and and make it happen rather than talking too much about what it really means. I was just thinking about what other things do I look at for next year. There's always a couple of new connectivity developments, and I'm not talking about 5G now. I mean, you shouldn't disregard what's happening in the low power space.
Right.
And there's a lot of stuff happening.
The licensed and unlicensed, the LoRaWANs and NB-IoTs and all that?
I mean, and there's been a lot of talk and a lot of promise in the early days that wasn't really met. I think in recent years, we've seen a bit more acceleration of these technologies, particularly LoRa and NB-IoT, not so much some of the others. But an interesting one is now Amazon Sidewalk, to be seen whether it's going to prevail and going to have that big of an impact. But when Amazon is behind something, you got to take it serious, I think. So they're building this essentially low power Wi-Fi of like they're connecting different people's Wi-Fi's to make that into some low power network. And you're sharing that with your neighbors and essentially have a new network because everybody's connected Wi-Fi devices somehow included in that.
So that's like your doorbell and your Echo Dot.
Yeah.
And it extends only I forget how many meters out, but it extends a little bit out from the house, and then you have to hope that there's this mesh of compatible devices that can pick this up and do something.
But I think that's one of those areas where in 2021 we will get a reading of how widely is that going to be picked up. And then really interesting is these new satellite technologies. So especially these smaller satellites. So think of satellite and recently. So usually it was like $1 million projects, and now you have these micro satellites on a lower orbit, and they span an IoT network. China recently, just shot up 12 of these and make an IoT network for China, and it's still expensive to operate, but it's ubiquitous. That's truly ubiquitous from a point of view that you can anywhere in the desert you can pick up that signal, and so that in combination with some of these low power standards should be quite powerful.
Well, that serves. I tend to think, what problem does it solve? So, remote assets. An oil field that's out in the middle of the North Sea, over your shoulder there, or agricultural things, crop monitoring, things where you want low power and geographically dispersed. That makes a degree of sense. Or, in the middle of the desert. Yes.
Whole supply chain. I mean, having the ability to connect to your whatever you're moving around the world from where like all I need to do it, even if it's just the 2 or 3 different connectivity, even if it's just the fallback option. To connect to it. So there's some cool developments happening in that area.
I'm also seeing, and maybe this will be, kind of we're on the home stretch here, just time wise, but I'm seeing this. I don't want to say vendor lock-in, but there's this edge battle for AWS wavelength, and IBM has one called IBM Satellite, which is not a satellite, and Azure has an edge thing. So you're starting to see. And this is particularly useful in the connected car, the autonomous vehicle space, but you still have, instantiations of the infrastructure coming to the edge and also coming to the, the cell tower near you. What's your view of that?
You mean who would win that?
No, the usability of that, the usefulness of it. I'm less concerned, will AWS win versus Microsoft? That's the vendor battle will get proven out by the market, but just there seems to be a new model for moving assets. Maybe that's a better way to frame up the question, where you might have again, you've got an edge device, maybe it's a connected car of some sort or a fleet vehicle that can talk to something that's a little bit more local, which then pulls back to the cloud. So it's sort of this new.
That's part of the new reality. And I think the edge, there's a bunch of reasons why the edge is so important. And there's a bunch of different edges as well. So I think one of the things that's very important to realize, again, we talked about IoT, meaning different things to different people. Same for edge. We use 6 different types of edges, from what we call I think we call it the telco edge, which is your local data center next to the cell tower, which is an important element of 5G, because that's partially enabling this low latency, because you're not sending it very far away to compute, but you're doing it there.
Right.
But then you go down, you have some kind of smaller server size wherever you are, to kind of a gateway type device. And then you talk about sensors that have some kind of capabilities attached to it that can do some computation. That is also edge computing.
Yes.
And all of this is becoming more powerful. And within, if you're sensing, let's say you're sensing very popular application, predictive maintenance or something, you're sensing some vibration here. Do you need to send it all the way up to the cloud to then have the result that, oh yeah, that means it's failing? No, you can do that on a different level. You save costs, you save time, latency, and so maybe you train the model in the cloud, but you then deploy it to the edge, so you don't have to constantly run cloud computing resources. So from that point of view, this edge to cloud connection is hugely important, because all the computation these days is becoming distributed, at least among all or some of these different layers that are just laid out, and that is the future. And that's also why cloud importance doesn't go away, but why edge also becomes more important. And it's really about this distributed computation across the whole stack, which is why these tools from AWS and from Microsoft and so on become so important in order to manage the whole thing.
I think it makes good sense. Yeah, let's leave it there. I do want to thank you again for your time and for your interest in working with us. People can find your research. Some of it is available quite openly. It's IoT-analytics.com, if I remember correctly, IoT-analytics.com. And I have found it to be a wealth of information to prepare for discussions or work with some of the other things that I work on. I think the data is valid. The insights that I'm able to see sort of out there are pretty good, and I see them incorporated and quoted by quite a lot of people. So, my compliments to you and your team on putting together some really useful data that those of us that think we're practitioners in this space can find useful. So I think it's great stuff. But thank you very much for doing this. And I don't know if you have any parting comments, but thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I enjoy it a lot. I'm happy to have a part two if that's interesting to you, and I enjoy the conversation as well. We didn't talk anything COVID. I assume you've done that the whole last year. But I think if there's one thing that I would like to share that we didn't discuss today is,
yes, please.
This digital transformation wave that you may have heard before and that people talk about, it's real, it's coming, it's happening, and IoT and related areas are part of it to a large degree. Our surveys all confirm that companies are looking at spending more on these technologies. So be ready for 2021 when hopefully the clouds lift. Lift is wrong word. When the clouds fade away, I think we're going to have a little bit of a digital boom, which will be felt everywhere. And we can discuss in more depth at some other point in time.
Yeah, I completely agree. You opened up a new topic, but I would say this quickly. The notion of supply chain management and cold chain, especially around the new coronavirus shots, where you have to keep them at a certain temperature, and all of that stuff. Those were use cases that we were talking about 6 or 8 years ago around cold chain and supply chain as a key asset management use case for IoT. So I think obviously COVID and the vaccines have really brought that to the forefront. Here in the States, we have a lot of news stories on the various, UPS and Federal Express, all the shippers leveraging cold chain technology. So I think, people are seeing the light on that. So
but I would argue that's only the tip of the iceberg, because it's a couple of very tangible use cases that you can see right now. But underneath, there are more structural themes. And I'm just going to throw out one other buzzword: cybersecurity, which for various reasons have just structurally accelerated and are going to be more important and going to see more investment after this is all over. And there's we have a list of 20 or so other themes, and some of them less obvious. And there's a lot coming. So there's going to be an interesting digital wave ahead of us.
I think that'll be a good teaser for part 2 of this discussion. So again, I want to thank you, and please send my compliments to your team for the great work they've been doing as well. And to our audience, stay tuned. I think you're now aware that we're going to try and plan a part 2 of this, and stay tuned also on our conference. So thanks again.
Thanks, Mark.